What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and Show, where I, Graham G.S. and Matthews, break down all the original content I watch on the WWE Network, on Peacock, and on Viceland. Today we're talking Season 3, Episode 6 of Dark Side of the Ring, entitled In the Shadow of Grizzly Smith. So this was the episode all about Jake Roberts' family, the background there. I had no idea until the first 30 seconds of the episode that Rockin' Robin, who I'm familiar with her work from WWE and being one of the first early WWE Women's Champions, I had no idea they were siblings. So that was a news flash to me right out of the gate. But I've heard a lot about this episode going into the season and just how dark and how fucked up the childhood and the livelihood and everything that Jake Roberts and his family had to go through, growing up and whatnot, just how fucked up it was. But I didn't really know until watching the episode how far deep it really went and stuff like that in regards to the father, Grizzly Smith, and how much trauma and trouble they had to go through growing up. I would say this was a really good episode, and it was. It deals with such sensitive content and really traumatic stuff for a lot of people who have likely experienced the same thing. So it is tough to say it's a great episode, especially like with the Benoit episode and the Owen Hart episode, the Brian Pillman episode, all of which I would say were the best of the shows so far of all 3 seasons up to this point. But that being said, though, I mean, obviously with the content and the material that it deals with, it can be a lot harder for certain people to get through it than others. So that's definitely understandable. But it is well worth the watch. I enjoyed the Warrior one after hearing more about the A&E special and the fact they actually did cover a lot of the stuff that Darkseid did too. And Darkseid missed out on quite a bit of stuff like the roids and stuff like that, but I realized later on they're likely saving that for its own episode, not just on Warrior, but they're doing a whole episode on the steroid trials and stuff like that later on in the season. So that's probably why they missed out on that with the Warrior episode. But like the racist comments he made, the gay comments, stuff like that, all of which they actually discussed in the A&E special too. They tried to whitewash it a little bit, but they actually acknowledged it, which surprised me. I haven't watched it yet. I just heard that about the documentary. So I would say probably in retrospect, not the best episode. If you watch the A&E one, that one was slightly stronger. But, a lot of the episodes so far this season of Dark Side of the Ring have been very good, this one being no exception. So again, like I said, we find out in the first opening minute of the documentary that Sam Houston, whose name I've heard of before, real name Michael Smith, and Rockin' Robin are actually Jake's brother and sister in real life, which I never knew that. Maybe I've heard of that before, I just never knew that, or recently discovered it by watching this episode, so that's news to me from, again, right out of the gate. But the siblings weren't close, because growing up, some of them had more issues with the father, Grizzly Smith, than others, and Grizzly was also involved very heavily in the wrestling business, which we'll get into. So like I said, Sam Houston's real name is Michael Smith. They have another brother named Richard Smith. He was not involved with wrestling. He revealed that Jake's name growing up, and his real name is Aurelian, I believe is how you pronounce it. His nickname growing up was Buster. Didn't want to use that in wrestling, so he went by Jake the Snake instead. But Richard didn't like the traveling. That was the real reason why he never got involved with wrestling, like with Michael and Robin and Jake and even the father. He was like the one outlier that didn't get involved with wrestling because he didn't like the attention. He didn't like the traveling as much as someone like Jake did. And Jake didn't really have the body, not that he didn't have the body of a professional wrestler, but that wasn't what he was known for. His physique was not his, strongest attribute as a professional wrestler. It was really the psychology, and he knew his way around the ropes and knew how to tell a story and make you think certain things, was able to make you think that he was a real snake in the grass, as Jim Cornette says on this episode. And Jim Cornette is all over this episode, as he was the Warrior one and many others, the Brian Pillman episode. Jim Cornette is like their designated wrestling historian on all of these seasons of Dark Side of the Ring. So if you don't like Jim Cornette, you probably didn't like his involvement with the episode, but he had a lot to it from like that historian perspective. So we find out that Jake kind of learned the ropes from his dad, but they were obviously not close at all. His dad, apparently, according to Jake, did not want Jake wrestling, to the point where when he got involved with the business, Grizzly would ask the promoters to fire Jake because he had so much influence and power in the industry at that point. Did Grizzly, he was able to do that. He had the pull to ask these promoters, hey, don't hire this kid. Don't hire my son, blah, blah, blah. He's not going to be worth your time. He's terrible, blah, blah, blah. So Jake reveals he actually got into wrestling because he hated his father, which was interesting. So I don't know where I think it was Robin who had said that he learned the ropes from Grizzly. but I'm not exactly sure. I'm sure it wasn't a close relationship, so I'm not sure if he taught him how to wrestle or where he learned how to learn to wrestle specifically, unless they mentioned that I just missed it. But his end goal the entire time was to hear his dad say that he was proud of him, which he never got, I guess, growing up. Getting into the business and everything that he went through, he never really got that feedback from his father when he eventually became a professional wrestler. He was really cold towards him, not heartwarming whatsoever, really never had his support. And not only did he not have his support, he was vehemently against the idea of him getting involved with the business. So they talk about Grizzly originally working in oil fields, and he was just a huge-ass guy, to the point where he would pay people, or people would pay him, rather, after work just to punch him in the fucking stomach to see if he would go down. And that was how he would make extra money. And he realized, well, there might be a future in this whole wrestling thing, because I guess either worked with people that were involved with wrestling, or he just knew them, or whatever. So that was how he kind of got involved with the business, was through his size. He was a massive, massive dude. Michael, who I'll refer to as Sam, his real name is Michael, but they call him Sam throughout the documentary, so I'll just call him Sam. Sam saw his dad as Superman, because he was just this massive guy. He'd go to the matches, see him do all this cool shit, whatever. Jake calls him really, really fucking mean. He was just an absolute asshole. His dad wouldn't tell the kids really anything. Grizzly wouldn't tell the kids anything about his status and how he would get the shit kicked out of him and open up, and his skin would just be completely disgustingly gross and open and all this other shit. He wouldn't tell him anything, so Jake said he would go to bed many times thinking his dad was going to die. Eventually, Grizzly retired in the late 1970s before transitioning into a management role behind the scenes. And Cornette tells this story about how, either at meetings or with the other boys or whatever, he would joke about mentoring young girls. And everyone kind of took it as a joke. And Jim Cornette's like, well, that's a little fucking strange. Like, why are we laughing at that? And there was obviously a lot more to that than what was being let on at that point. We hear from Nicola Roberts, and no relation there to Jake technically. I mean, obviously Jake Roberts, blah, blah, blah. That has nothing to do with Jake Roberts. That's just her real name, and she went by the name Baby Doll in wrestling. So she was married to Michael at one point, and we hear about that story a little bit later on. We don't hear from her a whole bunch on this episode, but she kind of talks about her own dealings with Grizzly on this episode. So that was kind of the perspective that she added from the outside looking in. So she mentioned how when she was on the road with Sam, Michael, whatever, Grizzly used to pick up like 15-year-old girls during these road trips, and no one really thought anything of it, including her, until like much later on. So we hear from Jake again, who talks about how he hasn't felt really like Aurelian, which is his real name, in close to 30 or 40 years. He had to leave that person behind. He was still a kid. He couldn't be a kid anymore. He had his childhood robbed of him, essentially. He can't be Aurelian anymore. He's been Jake the Snake Roberts ever since he started going by that name early on in his career. He calls his dad a pedophile who impregnated Jake's mother when she was 13 years old, which is fucking disgusting. And apparently, I guess they were forced to marry, Grizzly and Jake's mom. But they divorced by the time, or she was able to divorce him by the time she was 17. So Jake eventually lived with his grandmother until she passed away. And then he had to live back with the dad again and his stepmom, or, his dad's Grizzly's new wife or whatever, who was extremely sexually abusive towards Jake Roberts. He mentioned how, she would play games and all this other shit, really fucking gross shit. And then one time he told on her to Grizzly, and before he can kind of finish his story, she cut him off, said, "I'll deal with you later," and then beat him up with a clothes hanger and a fucking fly swatter later on in the night or day or whatever it was. So he was mentally fucked up from that. Meanwhile, Grizzly never really did anything else about it. Never, he would hear these accusations from Jake about the stepmom, about his new wife, but he wouldn't do anything because meanwhile, all while this is going on with Jake and the mom, or the stepmom rather, he was doing that same exact shit to Jake's sisters or stepsisters or whatever, with the stepmom's kids and Jake's stepsisters, whatever. So he was doing the exact same shit with them, specifically Robin, who tells her side of the story and how he would play mental games with her and pretend that, he hated her and to kind of make her think certain things. A manipulator, essentially. He was a master manipulator to kind of steal that nickname from Edge, but in a real-life situation. He wouldn't talk to her for, a day or days at a time because he wanted to, when the mom left to go to work or whatever and he was still there with her, he wanted to endear himself to her. So that's what he would do. The mom would leave, he would put his hands on her, she said. And we don't need any real specifics and kind of imagine what she's talking about here, or just only assume. And that's what would happen. This went on for years. Like, it first started happening, she said, when she was around 8 or 9 years old. She didn't know how to process it. Any real part of her childhood that was still there was gone at that point. And it lasted until she was 14, she said, which is absolutely disgusting. So she eventually told her mom about it. They left. She got pissed. Why she would get so pissed that he was doing that to her daughter when she was doing that to Jake, I don't know. But Robin said that she threatened to shoot him years later, saying like when she was 18 or 17 or whatever it was, because she knew where his guns were. She said, listen, if you ever try that shit on me again or try to do anything else, if I find out you're doing it to more people or whatever, I will take your gun and fucking shoot you. That's how, she stood up for herself, and obviously not a lot of people are able to, but she was able to, which was good for her. But yeah, when Robin hears about Jake's side of the story, about what her mom was doing to Jake, she doesn't like defend it or even dismiss it or whatever. She kind of says that he was probably telling her to do that, and that she probably already knew that Grizzly was doing what he was doing. Why she would leave after so many years of him doing that and not just immediately, I don't know. But she believes that he kind of like coerced her or manipulated her into doing it to Jake, which, I mean, whatever, they're probably just equally shitty people. She kind of sounds like she's defending her a little bit and saying that it was Grizzly's influence, but any person that is fucked up enough to do that probably isn't solely doing it because of someone else's influence. There has to be something else beneath the surface there as well, if that makes sense. So, there's probably more to that story, but that was Robin's side of the story in terms of what her mom did to Jake. So, an older sister eventually shows up named Jolynn, who was, I don't know if it was his stepsister or her actual older sister, I don't remember exactly. But she shows up, and she had dealt with Grizzly before. And, like, they went out, and it was obvious, without being too obvious about it, that she was trying to ask Robin if she felt safe, asking about Grizzly, and, if she had any weird experiences with her and whatever, or with him, rather. I don't know if she outright told her, like, yeah, this is what he's been doing to me, blah, blah, blah. I don't remember. But that was the extent of their interaction. So, not too long after, maybe like 2 weeks, I think, the kids were out, like, dancing or doing something. That included Robin. I don't know if it was Jake. Definitely Robin, Richard, and Sam. So they were out, and they were told to go home by their dad. And they go home, and they find a note from their father saying that Jolynn had been kidnapped. Richard was fucking pissed because he was really close with her up to that point, so he punched a wall. She had a kid at that point, so she was probably 20 or 18 or something along those lines. We hear from Buzz, the police chief, and I think it was Tatum, Texas, I think it was. He was like the police chief at that point. A lot of this type of stuff didn't happen normally in that part of the state. So this was kind of like an abnormal situation for him. Like, this was kind of something out of the ordinary that he was dealing with, and he recalls it very vividly, which is, he has that recollection of it, which is good for the episode. So he shows up at her house, and they probably assume that these guys showed up, took her away, and we come to find out that it was the ex-wife of Jolynn's husband, who she had married. She was married at that point, had kids with this guy, at least one kid. And the husband's ex-wife was the one who was behind it, they assumed, because they found letters there. And she eventually, admitted to it. So they think it must have been like a couple of guys that kidnapped her, and not this woman, because she was, smaller than Jolynn was, and Jolynn used to wrestle with her brothers and shit, so she could definitely defend herself. So it wasn't just one person, they assume. It was probably a bunch of people. And they never outright say or explain, like, maybe she hired someone or a couple of people to kidnap her. Like, was she psycho? Like, they didn't really go into that too much. But they left the baby behind. The baby wasn't hurt or anything. It was just Jolynn they had kidnapped. And that was when Buzz, entered the apartment, found the baby behind, blah, blah, blah. So they find the ex-wife. She eventually admits to it. She confesses to kidnapping Jolynn. I don't think it was her herself, she said, or if she was just behind it. Either way, she was like, yeah, I kidnapped her, but she escaped. But they can't find her. They never found a body. They can't even declare it a murder because there's no body to make it a murder charge, a charge her on murder. So that was like the first time they said, I think Jake said that Grizzly missed the wrestling match. That's how big a situation this was for him, and he went to court about it, and she eventually was sentenced to 33 years in prison. She served 7 of it, but she got initially 33, which, what a fucking joke. Grizzly was so pissed that I think he had like piano wire wrapped in like wood or something like that on 2 ends of it, and he was going to strangle her if he got close enough to her, I think in the courtroom. So they had like multiple like guards surrounding this woman because they didn't want Grizzly to kill her. So he was fucking pissed about it. But at the same time, though, they're discussing this, they bring up how one of the kids, and also Buzz, the police chief, had mentioned that they went to her work, they found out there was an incinerator there, so whoever was behind this, the body was likely burned, so that's probably what happened. So Robin not assumes, but she speculates whether Grizzly was involved with it, because one of the siblings, I don't know if it was Robin or Richard or Sam or whoever, Jake, they wanted to bring the murder to Unsolved Mysteries and help them try to solve it because it was an unsolved mystery. Grizzly said no. Why would you not want to bring it to them, you know? And Richard even says, like, oh, I would love to say I walked in on it one time crying about it, was extremely broken up about it, but no, not even one time was he ever crying about the fact that he lost his daughter. So really sketchy shit, and they kind of leave it at that and they move on from it, but they want you to believe that there was a decent chance that Grizzly was involved, because Robin even mentions, like, oh, I'm thinking in my head, oh, who would have the most to lose with with Joe Lynn still around? And it would be Grizzly, of all the shit that he did to her, and if that ever got out, that he was doing this to his own daughter, let alone all these other women, his career was fucking over. So there probably is more to that. It was just a really weird, sketchy situation. But then they move on from it, because that's not what the entire episode is about. So anyway, Jake talks about how he incorporated that hate that he had towards his father into the character, and that was how Jake the Snake kind of came to be. Meanwhile, Robin trained with a man named Nelson Royal and trained only with guys, so she could hit like a guy, according to Vince McMahon, because she had a WWE tryout. He was impressed. Her tryout was with Sensational Sherry, actually. Soon after she was signed, won the Women's Championship in France. They recapped the title win, which was cool. At one point, all 3 kids were in WWE at the same time: Jake, Robin, and Sam. Sam had the worst career of the 3 of them, obviously, because him being on the thinner side, according to Cornette, was what hurt him in the NWA and hurt him in WWE. At the same time, he was a big drinker. Kind of followed in his father's footsteps in that respect. And addiction apparently runs in the family. I mean, between this and, you know, Robin would become an alcoholic later on. It just kind of trickled down from the father to all the other kids, unfortunately. At least most of them. Definitely Jake. I'm not sure about Richard too much, but definitely Jake and the other kids. So yeah, during this whole situation, like we hear from, you know, we hear from Michael Sam's ex-wife and how she eventually had to leave him because he had so many problems. Like, you know, he went to jail and he had repeat offenses, and he always did the community service, he said, but he would get out of doing jail time because Grizzly knew everyone in town. So we can get out of him doing jail time and having to serve this sentence and whatever else. So he was kind of following in his father's footsteps in that respect. So eventually he did have to go to jail. I think he was in jail for a long time. He was in jail when Grizzly passed away in 2010. I'm not sure if that was for the same sentence or if that was for something else, but he was in jail for a really fucking long time. So in the middle of all of this, apparently Grizzly showed up to Robin's house one night with a fucking 9-year-old girl, which is so disgusting. And she said immediately as soon as she saw him with this girl, like, her heart just sank. She turned completely just pale white because it was just a disgusting sight. I guess because, like, he asked her to make her, like, a margarita, like a sangria, or some sort of, like, alcoholic drink, I think. Or maybe it was for him. I don't know what the fucking story was. But he went to sleep, and then Robin started asking this poor girl all these questions about, like, oh, has he tried to kiss you and all this other shit. And she wasn't, like, alarmed by the questions, but she was clearly uncomfortable. So as soon as Robin got a better understanding of what was going on, he was like, oh, yeah, we're heading out. And she's like, no, you're not. Well, I mean, you are. You're getting the fuck out of my house. She's staying with me. Get out of here. And it worked, thankfully. So I thought that was a great thing for her to do. So, yeah, I already mentioned the community service and all the jail time that Sam had to do because he was like drinking and driving a lot. Like the Mothers Against Drunk Driving were fucking, they hated this guy. They wanted him behind bars. He was a threat and a danger to society at that point. He eventually had to go to jail, try to hang himself in jail, but the knot broke. And he knew how to tie knots, but for whatever reason, maybe there's God has a reason or whatever. He doesn't exactly, elaborate, but the knot broke, and obviously he's still here now if he's being interviewed. But he tried to kill himself in jail. That's how much of in a bad way he was at that point in time. Meanwhile, as for Jake was a big cocaine guy. Like, obviously he was a drinker too, but cocaine was like his number one priority for a good chunk of his life there when he was in WWE and beyond that. He always showed up out of shape and in no condition to perform, according to Cornette. And you could just see it from the videos and the photos that he looked just fucking terrible at that point. He was just an absolute junkie. Like, he went home and he destroyed all of his mirrors because he couldn't even bear to look at himself. That's how bad of a way he was in, even at that point. As for Robin, WWE eventually phased out their women's division and they let her go. And because, she was out of work at that point or working a lot less, she became an alcoholic too. And Grizzly ruined her childhood, she said, but she wasn't going to let him ruin the rest of her life by kind of, again, following in his footsteps and becoming an alcoholic just like he was. Because he could drink like 32 drinks or some shit like that. I guess he drank at Sam's wedding with that woman baby doll. So anyway, they find out, or not find out, but they talk about how we find out rather, that Grizzly died in 2010 from Alzheimer's, complications of Alzheimer's, and I guess Richard was the one that was serving as his caregiver until the very end. Sam was in prison at that point, just the worst place apparently you can find out news like that, is what Sam says. And, Jake brings up that he never apologized for what he did earlier on in Jake's life. He never actually even addressed it. It just kind of was what it was. Robin thinks that he never thought that what he did was wrong. And that was why he never really apologized. We hear from Baby Doll again, the ex-wife of Sam Houston, of Michael. And she brings up how Sam idolized his dad. And he probably would have forgiven him had he found out at that point what he was doing to his sister. And he didn't find out until a couple of years ago, according to him, because they had to talk about it. But yeah, he probably would have forgiven him because, he treated Sam so well compared to everyone else, and maybe Richard too, but he actually put Richard up for adoption, so probably not Richard, but Sam would kind of forgive him because he didn't do anything wrong to Sam, but he did to the other kid, so he probably would have just gotten over it had he even known about his demons a lot earlier than he did. But yeah, he talks about, Richard brings up how Grizzly at one point put Richard up for adoption and never apologized for it. He never expected him to. And they all talk about, we hear individual interviews with all four of them saying that they want to be closer. Richard wants to be closer with Robin, would love to know what it's actually like to have a sister. Sam says that he wants to be closer with all of them. Richard says the exact same thing. Robin says that, and she talks about, like, she even agreed to do this documentary and to give her side of the story because she wants to show that you're not always going to be completely past shit like this and struggles and, personal, not demons, but like a lot of these issues that she dealt with when she was a kid that weren't her fault at all. She wants to show that you're not going to be completely past these, experiences, but you don't have to stay in them and have them define who you are and what you can do and put a cap on your success and stuff like that. And she encourages people to tell someone. If you're going through it, tell someone, tell the police, tell a friend, tell your family, blah, blah, blah. And don't let it, define the rest of your life or get worse than it is, stuff like that. Jake says the exact same thing, saying that anyone dealing with this sort of thing absolutely just has to run from it. Tell someone about it, tell the police, tell your family, tell your friends, blah, blah, blah. Just get the fuck out of there. And he's not ashamed of himself anymore. He's 60-something years old now. We see shots of him in AEW, which is cool, at the AEW arena in Daly's place. And he just reemphasizes again to not give up. Anyone dealing with this sort of thing just can't give up. And that was the end of the episode. Again, I thought it was a great episode. Very fucking depressing, obviously. So it's hard to say like it was entertaining because it dealt with such terrible subject matter. And, hopefully people, I hate that people can even relate to this because it's just a terrible reality, but hopefully some people can get something out of it. But I thought it was a very good episode, though. I had no idea of Jake Roberts' backstory. So I'd heard a little bit about it going into this episode. So I'm glad we were finally able to get the episode on it. And I was able to find out more about the family and the background and Jake's upbringing and everyone else involved with the family. But yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. It definitely does deal with a lot of sensitive, subject material. So Just be wary of that. And they actually even open the episode with a graphic discussing that, kind of as a disclaimer, saying, "Hey, this is what this episode deals with. Viewer discretion is advised." Blah blah blah. But it was a good episode, so I'm looking forward to the mid-season finale next week on Dynamite Kid, actually, which is also bound to be equally dark. So they're saving the darker shit at the end of the episode, or rather the end of the season, or the mid-season anyway, because the rest of season 3 I think is premiering later on in 2021. So we have that to look forward to in the second half of the year. But yeah, be sure to like the video, drop a comment on this video, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more daily content. Check out more Dark Side of the Ring reviews down below. I'm discussing all the reviews and all the other episodes from Season 3, Season 2, and even Season 1 in that playlist down below. So have a great one, guys. Also, be sure to hit the bell button to be notified every time a new video goes up. I'm Graham G. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.